400 million years ago, the Earth was an alien world. We call it the Devonian Period. The oceans were not just bodies of water, they were highly competitive evolutionary laboratories. Apex predators like Dunkleosteus, a massive placoderm equipped with sheer bone blades instead of teeth, dominated the marine biome. This was the age of fishes, a critical epoch where jawed vertebrates first tested the mechanical limits of biological design. The intense evolutionary pressures here did not just create apex predators, they forged the biomechanical blueprints for almost all vertebrate life that would eventually inherit the Earth. But the true engine of planetary transformation was quietly operating far away from these predatory waters, spreading across the barren continents. For the first time in our planet's history, vascular plants evolved complex root systems. Early trees like Archaeopteris formed the first true terrestrial forests. These primordial roots physically shattered ancient bedrock and accelerated chemical weathering on a global scale, releasing vast quantities of nutrients into the oceans. This biological innovation fundamentally altered the planet's carbon cycle. Massive amounts of atmospheric carbon dioxide were drawn down and locked away in the soil, eventually plunging the Earth into a devastating biological crisis. Life on land was not merely adapting to the environment, it was actively re-engineering the entire climate system of the planet. This brings up a profound concept in astrobiology. If a newly emerging ecosystem can inadvertently trigger a global mass extinction by radically altering planetary chemistry, what does that indicate about the longevity of complex biospheres on other exoplanets? The Devonian Period serves as a perfect planetary laboratory to study how life can become a geological force, and perhaps how it can become its own great filter. As we strip away the geological layers to understand this pivotal era of oceanic monsters and ancient forests, we invite you to be part of this exploration into deep time. If you want to keep unraveling the complex systems that govern our universe, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel. Let us look deeper into the oceans of the Devonian. To understand the Devonian, we must first unmake the map of the modern world. Look at the Earth from orbit 400 million years ago, and you will see a planet dominated by a singular, immense body of water, the Panthalassic Ocean. This vast marine expanse covered roughly 80% of the globe, dwarfing the modern Pacific. The remaining 20% was land, but not in any configuration we would recognize today. The continents were locked in a slow, relentless drift, driven by the thermodynamic engine of the Earth's mantle. In the southern hemisphere, a colossal supercontinent known as Gondwana commanded the lower latitudes. This immense landmass aggregated what we now call South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia into a single, continuous expanse of ancient rock. Because Gondwana stretched across the South Pole, its sheer, immense physical presence dictated the flow of global ocean currents. Yet, paradoxically, for much of the early Devonian, there were no polar ice caps. The South Pole was a landscape of bare earth and rock, entirely exposed to the elements. Further north, straddling the equator, sat Euramerica, a supercontinent also known to geologists as Laurussia. This landmass was forged in the violent tectonic collision between the ancient plates of Laurentia and Baltica. When these massive continental shelves slammed together, they thrust up a colossal mountain range, the Caledonian Mountains, which rivaled the modern Himalayas in scale and elevation. But these mountains were more than just towering peaks. They acted as a massive geological machine with profound global consequences. As the newly uplifted silicate rocks were exposed to ancient rains and winds, they triggered chemical weathering on a planetary scale. This process slowly scrubbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, washing dissolved carbon and vital mineral nutrients down immense river systems and emptying them into the shallow epicontinental seas. This specific continental configuration established a global climate model starkly different from our modern Earth. The early Devonian was a profound greenhouse world. Global average temperatures were significantly higher, and the thermal gradient from the equator to the poles was much flatter. Without large land masses completely blocking the equatorial pathways, warm ocean currents circulated freely, distributing solar heat efficiently across the latitudes. Sea levels were exceptionally high, flooding the continental margins of both Gondwana and Euramerica to create vast, sunlit, shallow marine environments. These warm, stable inland seas became the perfect evolutionary cradles for a biological explosion of marine life. But how do we know the exact temperature of an ocean that vanished millions of years ago? Paleoclimatologists reconstruct these ancient environments by analyzing the chemical signatures locked in microfossils, specifically the tiny, tooth-like structures of ancient marine chordates called conodonts. By measuring the ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 isotopes preserved in the fossilized apatite, scientists can calculate a highly accurate temperature profile of the Devonian seas. The data reveals a stunning reality. Equatorial surface waters hovered around a sweltering 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and this deep warmth extended much further into the higher latitudes than it does in our current era. This extreme warmth fundamentally altered the fluid dynamics of the Panthalassic Ocean. In our modern icehouse world, cold, highly dense water from the polar ice caps sinks to the ocean floor, driving a vigorous global conveyor belt that oxygenates the deepest abyssal plains. But in the early Devonian, with no polar ice caps to generate this frigid sinking water, the ocean's vertical circulation was heavily constrained. The deepest layers of the global ocean were likely sluggish, stagnant, and dangerously depleted of oxygen. The Earth possessed a highly stratified ocean, a precarious system where a massive reserve of anoxic water lurked just beneath the vibrant, sun-drenched shallows. This geological arrangement forces us to look at a much broader cosmic question. In the modern search for habitable exoplanets, astronomers often focus purely on the habitable zone, the orbital distance where liquid water can exist on a planetary surface. But the Devonian Earth demonstrates that liquid water is merely the baseline requirement. Long-term habitability requires a functional planetary thermostat. On Earth, that thermostat is the carbon-silicate cycle, driven entirely by plate tectonics. Tectonic plates subduct carbon deep into the mantle, and volcanic activity eventually releases it back into the atmosphere, regulating global temperatures over timescales of millions of years. If an exoplanet lacks this active geological recycling system, its climate will eventually spiral out of control, either freezing solid or succumbing to a runaway greenhouse effect, much like Venus. This leads to a sobering hypothesis in astrobiology. Perhaps the great filter, the theoretical evolutionary barrier that prevents the widespread emergence of advanced civilizations in our galaxy, is not biological, but geological. Basic life might be relatively common in the universe, but planets with the precise internal thermodynamic balance required to sustain plate tectonics for billions of years might be exceedingly rare. Without continuous tectonic activity to refresh the surface and regulate the atmosphere, early biospheres would likely suffocate or boil away before complex multicellular life could ever take hold. At a planetary scale, the meaning of these Devonian geological formations changes entirely. The continents were not just inert stages for life to act upon, they were active, critical participants, setting the stage for a rapidly approaching planetary crisis. The warm, ice-free world was not a permanent, stable state, it was a fragile equilibrium. The shifting tectonic plates, the massive mountain ranges, and the high carbon dioxide atmosphere had inadvertently created the exact conditions necessary for a radical biological innovation to conquer the land. And as the continents drifted, the first primitive plant life was beginning to exploit this very specific geological setup. If this framework holds true, it tells us that a planet's geology and its biology are not separate, isolated systems. They are a single, coupled mechanism. And in the Devonian, this planetary mechanism was preparing to push its biosphere past the absolute breaking point. The extreme thermal stratification of the Devonian oceans dictated much more than just global climate. It fundamentally engineered the specific physical environments where life was forced to adapt. While the deep abyssal plains were locked in cold, stagnant anoxia, the margins of the supercontinents experienced an entirely different fluid dynamic. The rotation of the Earth, combined with the uninterrupted trade winds sweeping across the vast Panthalassic ocean, generated powerful surface currents. When these colossal masses of moving water slammed into the continental shelves of Euramerica and Gondwana, they were forced upward in a process known as coastal upwelling. This mechanical lifting of deep water was the biological engine of the Devonian. Upwelling dragged ancient, nutrient-rich waters from the darker depths straight into the photic zone, the sunlit upper layer of the ocean. Phosphorus, nitrogen, and silica flooded the shallow coastal seas, igniting massive, sustained blooms of phytoplankton. This created localized environments of staggering biological productivity. But this hyperproductivity came with a severe evolutionary cost. These shallow epicontinental seas became intensely crowded thermodynamic arenas. In an environment packed with biomass, the fundamental problem of survival shifted. The challenge was no longer just finding food, it was extracting and processing energy faster and more efficiently than the organisms swimming next to you. For millions of years, vertebrate life had been confined to jawless fishes, the agnathans. These creatures were essentially mobile biological vacuums, possessing muscular pharynges that allowed them to suck up water, filter out organic detritus, and absorb oxygen. Their feeding mechanism was strictly passive. However, in the high-energy, fiercely competitive upwelling zones of the Devonian, passive filter feeding reached its absolute thermodynamic limit. Sucking mud and microscopic algae simply could not yield enough caloric energy to support larger body sizes or more complex nervous systems. But evolution rarely builds entirely new structures from scratch. It is a master of repurposing existing biological architecture. This brings us to one of the most profound biomechanical transformations in the history of life. Behind the mouth of jawless fishes lay a series of cartilaginous rods known as pharyngeal arches, or gill arches. Their primary function was structural, holding the gill slits open to allow water to pass over the respiratory filaments. In the oxygen-fluctuating environments of the shallow seas, natural selection heavily favored organisms that could pump water more efficiently over their gills. Over countless generations, the very first pair of these gill arches, the mandibular arch, began to enlarge and shift forward. Initially, this morphological change had nothing to do with eating. It was an adaptation for better breathing, a mechanical pump to force more oxygenated water into the pharynx. But at a certain critical threshold, this anatomical shift unlocked an entirely new functional paradigm. The forward-shifted mandibular arch developed a muscular hinge. The second arch, the hyoid arch, adapted to brace this new structure firmly against the cartilaginous brain case. Suddenly, these arches were no longer just holding gills open, they could snap shut. The jaw was born. This was not merely a biological milestone, it was a fundamental reprogramming of the planet's ecological energy flow. The transition from filter feeding to active biting meant that a vertebrate could now target, dismantle, and consume concentrated packets of biological energy, namely other animals. The jaw unlocked the thermodynamic vault of the ocean. This mechanism allowed for the rapid extraction of high-density proteins and lipids, driving a sudden, explosive increase in vertebrate body size and metabolic rate. But the problem does not stop at the predator. The invention of the jaw triggered a brutal, global evolutionary arms race. Herbivorous and smaller organisms were suddenly forced to defend against targeted, mechanical dismemberment. This pressure drove the rapid evolution of heavy dermal armor, seen in the placoderms, as well as the development of streamlined body plans for rapid evasion, and the refinement of complex sensory organs like paired eyes and lateral line systems to detect approaching threats. The architecture of almost every vertebrate on Earth today, including the human skeleton, was heavily dictated by the predator-prey dynamics initiated by this single anatomical shift in the Devonian seas. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this biological transition changes entirely. It forces us to look outward and reconsider the parameters of the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In astrobiology, we often assume that if simple life emerges on a habitable exoplanet, complex intelligent life is a likely eventual outcome. But the evolution of the jaw suggests that the path to intelligence is gated by extremely specific, perhaps improbable, biomechanical bottlenecks. To build a civilization, a species requires a highly complex, energy-demanding central nervous system. A human brain, for instance, consumes 20% of the body's entire energy output. This massive metabolic overhead is physically impossible to sustain on a diet of passively filtered microscopic algae. It requires the hyper-efficient caloric intake that only a highly articulated, mechanically leveraged feeding apparatus can provide. If we look at other worlds, we must ask a critical question. Is the repurposing of respiratory structures into mechanical hinges a universal inevitability of evolutionary geometry? Or was it a rare, highly contingent freak occurrence unique to the specific hydrodynamic pressures of Earth's Devonian period? If the developmental leap from a rigid filtering tube to a hinged jaw is mathematically improbable, then countless biospheres across the galaxy might be permanently locked in a state of primitive, low-energy stasis. Millions of ocean worlds might be teeming with life, yet entirely devoid of the biomechanical foundation necessary to support apex predators, complex brains, and ultimately technological civilizations. The profound silence of the cosmos might not be due to a lack of life, but a lack of jaws. The invention of the hinged jaw rapidly transformed the Devonian oceans into an evolutionary arms race of unprecedented scale. As predators became more efficient at extracting biological energy, prey species were forced to adapt or face immediate extinction. The dominant defensive strategy of this era was the evolution of heavy dermal armor. This gave rise to the placoderms, an entirely extinct class of armored fishes that represent one of the most aggressive biomechanical experiments in the history of life on Earth. Unlike modern fishes, the front half of a placoderm was encased in articulated plates of solid bone and dentine. From an engineering perspective, this biological armor was incredibly costly to construct and maintain. It required massive metabolic investment to extract calcium and phosphorus from the ocean and synthesize it into heavy plating. However, in the hyper-competitive upwelling zones of the Devonian, this immense thermodynamic cost was justified. The armor provided an almost impenetrable defense against the crushing bites of rival predators. But evolution is a relentless feedback loop. Defensive armor immediately creates selective pressure for a weapon capable of piercing it. This dynamic culminated in the apex predator of the Devonian seas, Dunkleosteus. For decades, paleontologists reconstructed Dunkleosteus as a massive serpentine leviathan reaching lengths of up to 10 meters. Because placoderms possessed internal skeletons made primarily of soft cartilage, only their heavily armored skulls fossilized. Our understanding of their bodies relied heavily on extrapolation. But modern paleontology relies on rigorous morphometric analysis rather than mere imagination. Recent studies analyzing the geometric proportions between the orbital and thoracic lengths of perfectly preserved smaller Placoderm fossils suggest a very different reality. The modern scientific consensus models Dunkleosteus not as a sleek cruiser, but as a heavily built, muscular torpedo, perhaps only 4 to 5 meters long. This morphological revision changes our understanding of its hunting strategy. It was not built for sustained pursuit. It was an ambush predator, a localized engine of extreme kinetic energy designed for catastrophic, instantaneous impacts. The true marvel of Dunkleosteus lies within its skull architecture. It did not possess true teeth, which are discrete structures of enamel and dentine embedded in a jawbone. Instead, Dunkleosteus weaponized the bone itself. The upper and lower jaws were equipped with massive bony extensions called nathal plates. When the jaws closed, these plates did not smash together like mammalian teeth. Instead, they slid past one another with microscopic precision, functioning exactly like a pair of industrial shear blades. This leads to a profound biomechanical mechanism. In most biological systems, continuous friction degrades a structure. Mammalian teeth wear down over time, eventually leading to starvation in older predators. But the nathal plates of Dunkleosteus turned friction into an evolutionary advantage. Every time the jaw snapped shut, the precise occlusion of the bony plates ground away the microscopic surface layers, continuously resharpening the edges. Dunkleosteus possessed a biological, self-sharpening guillotine, but the physical structure of the blade is only half of the equation. A shearing mechanism requires immense mechanical force. Here, the skull of Dunkleosteus demonstrates an astonishing level of biomechanical engineering. Most vertebrates have a rigid cranium, meaning only the lower jaw moves. Dunkleosteus possessed a unique craniothoracic joint, a highly specialized hinge connecting the heavily armored head shield to the thoracic shield covering its torso. Through a complex system of interconnecting muscles and ligaments operating as a 4-bar linkage system, Dunkleosteus could simultaneously drop its lower jaw and violently pull its entire upper skull backward and upward. This synchronized double hinge action allowed the mouth to open at terrifying speeds, dropping the internal pressure of the buccal cavity in less than 20 milliseconds. This created an intense localized vacuum, violently sucking water and prey directly into the strike zone. Immediately following this expansion, the jaw snapped shut with an estimated force exceeding 6,000 newtons, concentrating all that pressure onto the razor-thin edges of the self-sharpening plates. This mechanism was specifically evolved to shatter the thick dermal armor of other placoderms. In biomechanics, there is typically an evolutionary trade-off between speed and force. A jaw is usually fast but weak, or slow but powerful. Through the 4-bar linkage of its armored skull, Dunkleosteus achieved both simultaneously, a feat rarely replicated in the history of vertebrate evolution. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this extreme biological specialization changes entirely. When we look at a creature as perfectly engineered as Dunkleosteus, it is easy to assume that such apex dominance guarantees long-term survival. Yet, Dunkleosteus and all other placoderms went completely extinct at the end of the Devonian. They left no direct descendants. This presents a crucial lesson for astrobiology and our understanding of the longevity of complex life in the universe. High-level biological specialization is a double-edged sword. To sustain the massive caloric requirements of a highly articulated, heavily armored, rapidly expanding biological machine, an organism requires an incredibly stable and highly productive ecosystem. Dunkleosteus was perfectly adapted, but it was perfectly adapted to a very specific set of planetary conditions. The warm, stratified, hyperproductive shallow seas of a greenhouse Earth. If we apply this to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, it highlights a hidden vulnerability in the evolutionary process. The Great Filter may not just be a single dramatic event that wipes out primitive life. It may function as a series of thermodynamic traps. An alien biosphere might successfully evolve complex, highly intelligent apex organisms that perfectly master their immediate environment. But this very mastery locks them into a state of hyperdependency on a specific planetary climate state. When the host planet undergoes a rapid geochemical or climatic shift, the most advanced, specialized organisms are almost always the first to starve. The supreme biomechanical perfection of the placoderms did not save them. It condemned them when the world inevitably changed. And, as we will see, the very mechanisms driving the Earth's climate toward this catastrophic shift were not coming from the oceans, but from a silent revolution happening on the barren rocks above. While the biomechanical terror of Dunkleosteus captures the imagination, a rigorous debate is currently unfolding within modern paleontology regarding the true ecological role of the placoderms. For decades, the sheer abundance of heavy, armored skulls in the fossil record led scientists to assume these creatures were universally sluggish, bottom-dwelling brutes, or specialized apex predators. This is a classic example of fossilization bias. Because heavy bone preserves beautifully while soft tissue degrades, our early models of the Devonian oceans were skewed toward the most heavily armored organisms. However, recent geochemical analyses are overturning this monolithic view. By extracting microscopic samples from the fossilized nathal plates of various placoderm species and measuring the ratios of stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes, researchers can effectively reconstruct ancient food webs. The isotopic signatures reveal a stunning ecological diversity. Not all placoderms were apex predators. The data indicates they had rapidly radiated into almost every available marine niche. Some possessed flat, crushing plates designed to break open benthic mollusks, while others exhibited isotopic profiles suggesting a diet of zooplankton, effectively making them early versions of modern baleen whales. But this incredible evolutionary radiation exposes a profound vulnerability, one that is central to an ongoing scientific debate about how ecosystems collapse. The placoderms dominated the Devonian by relying on a single, fundamental biological strategy: heavy mineralized armor. Even the filter-feeding variants retained massive bony head shields. Constructing and carrying this armor requires an exorbitant metabolic budget. Calcium and phosphorus must be constantly harvested from the environment and synthesized into dense biological matrices. In the hyperproductive, warm, and nutrient-rich epicontinental seas of the early to mid-Devonian, this high-cost strategy was perfectly viable. The environment subsidized their extreme metabolic overhead. But evolution is an open system, and absolute dominance in one area always leaves a vacuum in another. While the placoderms invested everything in rigid defense and sheer bite force, a different lineage of vertebrates was quietly experimenting with a diametrically opposed survival strategy in the margins of these ancient reefs. These were the early chondrichthyans, the ancient ancestors of modern sharks and rays. To survive in an ocean ruled by biological tanks, the early sharks executed one of the most brilliant morphological regressions in evolutionary history. They abandoned heavy dermal bone almost entirely. Instead, they developed an internal skeleton made of cartilage. For a long time, evolutionary biologists viewed a cartilaginous skeleton as a primitive trait, a stepping stone on the way to true bone. Modern biomechanics has proven this entirely false. The loss of bone in sharks was a highly derived secondary adaptation, a deliberate evolutionary downgrade in armor to maximize another physical property: kinetic efficiency. Water is nearly 800 times denser than air. Moving a rigid, box-like armored placoderm through this medium generates massive form drag, requiring immense muscular energy just to maintain forward momentum. Cartilage, by contrast, is roughly half the density of bone. It is highly elastic, capable of storing and releasing mechanical energy with every lateral sweep of the tail. By replacing a rigid chassis with a flexible, lightweight, cartilaginous frame, early sharks transformed their entire bodies into highly efficient hydrodynamic springs. This morphological shift completely altered the predator-prey dynamic. The defense mechanism was no longer about absorbing the kinetic impact of a bite, it was about not being in the strike zone when the jaws snapped shut. Agility replaced armor. But the advantages of cartilage extend far beyond fluid dynamics. At a cellular level, maintaining a bony skeleton is metabolically expensive. Bone is highly vascularized living tissue that requires constant cellular remodeling. Cartilage is largely avascular and metabolically quiet. By adopting a cartilaginous skeleton, early sharks drastically lowered their baseline metabolic overhead. They simply required fewer calories to exist. This leads to a deeply significant ecological debate. Did the placoderms die out solely because of a sudden catastrophic change in the Earth's climate? Or were they already being slowly outcompeted by the sleeker, more metabolically efficient sharks? If an ocean environment experiences a sudden drop in primary productivity, perhaps due to changing ocean currents or a collapse in plankton populations, the apex organisms with the highest caloric requirements are the first to face starvation. The placoderms were trapped by their own evolutionary success. Their rigid, high-maintenance biology could not scale down. The sharks, operating on a fraction of the caloric budget, possessed the metabolic flexibility to endure prolonged periods of ecological scarcity. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this biological divergence changes entirely, offering a profound analogue for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When astrobiologists model the potential lifespans of advanced technological civilizations, they often face a similar thermodynamic paradigm. A young, rapidly expanding civilization might mirror the placoderms, highly dominant, heavily armored, and entirely reliant on massive, continuous energy consumption to maintain its complex infrastructure. As long as the planetary environment, or the host star, provides abundant, easily accessible energy, this civilization thrives. But if the Great Filter is not a sudden cosmic explosion, but rather a prolonged period of resource scarcity or sudden planetary instability, the placoderm civilization is uniquely vulnerable. Its infrastructure is too rigid, its energy requirements too massive to adapt to a sudden caloric deficit. Conversely, a civilization that survives deep time might resemble the early sharks. It would prioritize extreme metabolic efficiency, flexibility, and a low baseline energy overhead, engineering its technology and society to operate gracefully on minimal resources. If this dynamic holds true across the cosmos, the oldest and most successful alien civilizations will not be the loudest, the largest, or the most heavily fortified. They will be the quietest, the most adaptable, and the most profoundly efficient. And as we return to the Devonian, we will see that the environment was about to test the metabolic limits of every creature on Earth, driven by a silent green revolution spreading across the continents. While the heavy placoderms and the agile sharks waged a high-energy war in the open pelagic zones, a third distinct lineage of vertebrates was quietly mapping out a completely different biological trajectory in the chaotic margins of the Devonian seas. These were the osteichthyes, the bony fishes. Unlike the cartilaginous sharks, they retained a heavily mineralized internal skeleton. But unlike the placoderms, they abandoned external plates in favor of lightweight, overlapping scales. This group would eventually split into two distinct evolutionary branches, a divergence that dictates the fundamental architecture of nearly all advanced life on Earth today, and perhaps sets a stringent mechanical prerequisite for the emergence of technology anywhere in the universe. The first branch, the Actinopterigi, or ray-finned fishes, committed entirely to aquatic perfection. Their fins were supported by webs of skin stretched over flexible, parallel spines of dermal bone. From a fluid dynamics perspective, the ray-finned design is an absolute masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. The parallel rays can ripple and flex with microscopic precision, allowing for unparalleled maneuverability. They can hover, reverse, and dart through complex reef systems with minimal metabolic effort. Because of this kinetic efficiency, ray-finned fishes completely conquered the hydrosphere. They make up over 99% of all fish species alive today. But this biomechanical perfection operates as an evolutionary trap. The parallel arrangement of bones is optimal for generating thrust in a buoyant fluid, but it is structurally incapable of bearing concentrated vertical loads in a gaseous atmosphere. When exposed to gravity, a ray fin simply collapses under the weight of the organism. The ray-finned fishes optimized themselves into a biological corner, permanently locking their lineage into a strictly aquatic destiny. The second branch, the Sarcopterygiae, or lobe-finned fishes, took a biomechanical gamble that seemed, at first glance, highly inefficient. Instead of delicate, parallel rays, their fins were fleshy, muscular appendages, supported by a robust, centralized internal skeleton. The architectural core of this design is a single, massive basal bone, articulating directly with the shoulder or pelvic girdle. This singular bone, which is the exact evolutionary precursor to the humerus in our arms and the femur in our legs, branches outward into two secondary bones, the radius and ulna, which then fragment into a complex array of smaller bones. This specific geometric arrangement of one bone, two bones, and many bones is arguably the most consequential mechanical structure ever produced by natural selection. By anchoring the entire limb to a single, articulating basal bone, the lobe-finned design sacrificed the delicate, rippling agility of the ray-finned fishes. In open water, they were clunky, slower, and significantly less hydrodynamically refined. However, that single point of articulation created something entirely new in the vertebrate arsenal. It created a load-bearing, rotational joint. In the deep ocean, this feature offers absolutely no distinct advantage. But the Earth of the Devonian was not entirely deep water. The shifting tectonic plates were creating vast, shallow, epicontinental seas choked with the submerged roots of the very first terrestrial forests. In these tangled, hypoxic, and structurally complex tidal estuaries, the ability to swim fast was virtually useless. The environment demanded a creature that could pivot, push, and leverage its body against solid physical obstacles. The robust, single-bone chain of the lobe fin allowed these ancient fish to literally crawl over submerged logs and push their heavy bodies through dense aquatic vegetation. This leads to a profound evolutionary concept known as exaptation. The lobe-finned architecture did not evolve for walking on land. It evolved as a highly specialized tool for navigating cluttered, shallow water swamps. Yet, entirely by accident, this structure contained the exact mechanical blueprint required to defeat gravity. When a lobe-finned fish pushed against the mud, the compressive force traveled up the digits, localized through the two mid-limb bones, and transferred efficiently through the single basal bone directly into the heavy skeletal girdle. It functioned as a perfect accidental lever. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this anatomical divergence changes completely. It provides a highly specific mechanical filter for the Fermi paradox and our search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We often assume that an alien water world, a planet covered entirely by a deep global ocean, could easily harbor highly intelligent life. And neurologically, it certainly could. Dolphins and octopuses demonstrate that a liquid medium is no barrier to extreme cognitive complexity and problem-solving capabilities. But intelligence alone does not build a technological civilization. To manipulate the physical environment, to smelt metals, to harness electrical currents, and to construct radio telescopes, an organism requires highly articulated, weight-bearing appendages. A biosphere composed entirely of deep, open oceans will relentlessly favor the biomechanics of the ray-finned fishes, optimizing purely for fluid dynamics and speed. Without the chaotic, shallow, obstacle-dense coastal margins to heavily select for the clunky, robust architecture of a single-bone basal limb, an alien biosphere might remain permanently trapped in a state of aquatic grace. If this hypothesis holds true, it suggests that the emergence of a spacefaring civilization requires much more than just a habitable zone and liquid water. It demands a planet with highly active plate tectonics, capable of generating the extensive shallow tidal zones that physically force life to evolve mechanical leverage against solid matter. The eerie silence of the universe might be partially explained by the sheer rarity of this specific biomechanical transition. Billions of exoplanets might be teeming with brilliant minds trapped in perfectly streamlined bodies, mathematically prohibited from ever leaving their oceans, simply because their evolutionary history never required a single heavy bone to push against the mud. And as we trace this singular bone structure out of the water, we realize that the terrestrial stage for its ultimate test was already being violently prepared by the atmosphere itself. While the oceans were locked in a brutal biomechanical arms race of jaws and armor, the continents of Euramerica and Gondwana remained alien, silent, and desolate. For billions of years, the terrestrial surface of the Earth was nothing more than a barren lithosphere. It was a harsh, wind-scoured expanse of exposed silicate bedrock, pummeled by unfiltered ultraviolet radiation and extreme temperature fluctuations. There was no soil, only shattered regolith and dust. Life had occasionally ventured out of the water, but it was restricted to absolute biological margins, forming paper-thin crusts of cyanobacteria and primitive moss-like flora hugging the damp edges of ancient coastlines. The fundamental problem preventing life from conquering the interior continents was not a lack of oxygen or a lack of sunlight. It was a crisis of physics. In the ocean, water provides buoyancy, entirely negating the effects of gravity. A marine organism does not need to invest massive amounts of energy into supporting its own mass. But the moment an organism steps out of the water and into a gaseous atmosphere, gravity becomes absolute. To colonize the land, life had to engineer a way to stand up, and, more importantly, it had to figure out how to transport heavy liquid water upward against the relentless pull of the Earth's mass. This biological hurdle led to one of the most sophisticated microfluidic engineering breakthroughs in planetary history: the vascular system. Early terrestrial plants developed specialized tube-like cells called tracheids. These cells are essentially microscopic plumbing networks, forming a tissue known as xylem. But plants do not have a mechanical heart to pump water upward. Instead, they rely on the sheer physical properties of water molecules themselves. Through a mechanism known as the cohesion tension theory, as water evaporates from the microscopic pores at the top of the plant, it creates a powerful negative pressure, effectively pulling the next water molecule up the chain. Because water molecules chemically bond to one another through hydrogen bonding, this evaporation at the canopy physically drags a continuous, unbroken thread of water all the way up from the damp ground. But this system comes with a catastrophic structural flaw. Liquid subjected to intense negative pressure is highly volatile. If the tension becomes too great, the water column can snap, creating a vacuum bubble in a process called cavitation, which instantly, permanently blocks the micropipe. Furthermore, the sheer physical force of this internal vacuum threatens to crush the fragile cell walls inward, collapsing the plant's vascular system completely. Cellulose, the primary building block of plant cell walls, has excellent tensile strength, meaning it can stretch, but it is terribly weak under compression. A plant built only of cellulose is essentially a wet noodle. It can only grow a few inches before collapsing under its own weight and internal negative pressure. To build vertical architecture, evolution had to invent an entirely new class of biological material. The solution was a highly complex, chaotic organic polymer called lignin. Unlike proteins or DNA, which are neatly ordered, predictable sequences, lignin is a dense, highly cross-linked, three-dimensional macromolecule. When plants began depositing lignin into the spaces between their cellulose fibers, it fundamentally altered their material properties. Lignin acted like the concrete poured over the rebar of cellulose. It waterproofed the xylem pipes, preventing cavitation, and provided immense compressive strength. Wood was born. With the invention of lignin-reinforced vascular tissue, the biological speed limit of the continents was completely shattered. Plants were no longer restricted to hugging the wet rocks. They could aggressively defy gravity. Within a relatively short geological window, the Earth saw the rapid evolution of Archaeopteris, the planet's first true tree, capable of reaching heights of nearly 30 meters. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this anatomical breakthrough changes entirely, establishing a rigorous physical parameter for the existence of advanced biospheres across the cosmos. We frequently search for super-Earths, rocky exoplanets significantly more massive than our own, assuming their thicker atmospheres and stronger magnetic fields make them ideal havens for life. But the physics of the Devonian vascular system suggests a hidden mechanical bottleneck. On a super-Earth with double the gravity of our planet, the sheer hydrostatic pressure required to pull a column of water upward would double. The negative pressure within the xylem would become so extreme that it might exceed the physical burst strength of any known organic polymer, including lignin. If the biochemical limits of carbon-based polymers cannot withstand the hydraulic tension required in a high-gravity environment, then tall forests might be physically impossible on massive planets. Without the three-dimensional architecture of forests to regulate planetary humidity, drive deep chemical weathering, and create complex terrestrial habitats, a high-gravity biosphere might remain permanently stunted, restricted to flat, primitive ground cover. The capacity for a planet to support a towering, complex terrestrial ecosystem and the advanced animal life that relies on it might be delicately calibrated to the exact mass and gravitational well of the Earth itself. But the invention of lignin did not just conquer gravity, it inadvertently triggered a geochemical time bomb. Because lignin was such a novel, wildly complex and chaotic molecular structure, the Earth's biological decay cycle was completely unprepared for it. When these massive early trees died and fell, there were very few, if any, fungi or bacteria equipped with the highly specialized enzymes required to break the lignin bonds apart. This leads to a profound ecological consequence. The trees of the Devonian were pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to build their wooden trunks. But when they died, that carbon was not being recycled back into the air through decomposition. It was piling up, burying itself, and locking millions of tons of carbon into the lithosphere. The terrestrial biosphere had suddenly become a runaway carbon sink. And as these ancient forests aggressively pushed upward into the sky, they were simultaneously deploying an equally aggressive biological technology downward, shattering the ancient bedrock and rewriting the chemical balance of the global ocean. The sheer verticality made possible by the invention of lignin allowed terrestrial life to command three-dimensional space for the very first time. But to truly understand the scale of this ecological revolution, we have to look at the specific biological architecture of the organism that drove it. The undisputed monarch of the late Devonian continents was a genus called Archaeopteris. When paleontologists first discovered its fossilized remains in the Catskill Formation of New York, they were deeply confused. The fossils presented a profound biological chimera. The trunk of the organism was composed of dense, heavily lignified wood, nearly indistinguishable from a modern gymnosperm like a pine or cedar. Yet its branches did not hold needles or flat leaves. They bore the wide, delicate, deeply lobed fronds of a primitive fern. Furthermore, it did not produce seeds. Archaeopteris reproduced by releasing millions of microscopic spores, an ancient mechanism that strictly required a film of liquid water for fertilization to occur. This reproductive constraint forced a brilliant architectural solution. To survive and reproduce away from the immediate edges of the swamps, Archaeopteris had to carry its water with it. It achieved this by inventing the true forest canopy. Unlike earlier plants that grew as simple vertical stalks, Archaeopteris developed extensive lateral branching, fanning its massive fern-like fronds horizontally to maximize the interception of solar radiation. As millions of these trees spread across the supercontinents, their interlocking branches created a profound physical phenomenon that had never before existed on the terrestrial surface of the Earth: persistent, continuous shade. Shade is not merely the absence of light, it is an active ecological engineer. Before the canopy, the barren lithosphere was subjected to wild, extreme temperature swings and blistering ultraviolet radiation, instantly evaporating any surface moisture. By blocking the sun, the canopy of Archaeopteris drastically lowered the surface temperature of the ground. Furthermore, as the massive root systems pulled water up from the deep water table, the leaves released it into the air through transpiration, trapping high levels of humidity beneath the branches. Archaeopteris effectively engineered a self-sustaining microclimate, a localized atmospheric bubble that insulated the forest floor. It terraformed the hostile, dry continents into a damp, dark, and highly stable environment, perfectly satisfying the exact biological requirements needed for its own spores to reproduce. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this canopy changes entirely. It forces us to reconsider the parameters of planetary observation and the search for extraterrestrial life. When modern astronomers analyze the atmospheric composition of exoplanets passing in front of their host stars, they are measuring the macroclimate. But the Devonian forests demonstrate that an advanced biosphere does not simply adapt to a planetary climate, it actively isolates itself from it. If an alien civilization evolved within a highly stratified, multi-layered forest environment, the primary evolutionary drivers shaping their early biology and technology would not be the broad planetary weather systems, but the tightly controlled, biologically artificial interior of the forest itself. We might be looking for civilizations adapted to harsh planetary conditions, completely missing that advanced life aggressively engineers its way out of those conditions as quickly as possible. But the true, terrifying power of Archaeopteris was completely invisible from the surface, hidden deep beneath the engineered soil. To support the massive weight of a 30-meter lignified trunk and a sprawling canopy against the relentless force of gravity and wind, a shallow root system was biologically useless. Archaeopteris developed the first true, deep taproots. These were thick, heavily armored biological wedges driven vertically downward, penetrating meters into the solid Devonian bedrock. This was a violently active mechanical process. The growing tips of these root networks generated immense hydraulic pressure, literally fracturing the solid silicate crust of the Earth. But the physical shattering of the lithosphere was merely the prelude to a far more destructive biochemical assault. As these deep roots penetrated the fractured bedrock, they actively exuded highly concentrated organic acids. Furthermore, the cellular respiration of the root systems pumped massive volumes of carbon dioxide directly into the microscopic fissures of the stone. When this concentrated carbon dioxide mixed with deep groundwater, it formed carbonic acid. Archaeopteris had inadvertently built a subterranean chemical factory designed to dissolve solid rock. This initiated silicate weathering on a staggering, unprecedented global scale. The ancient continental bedrock literally dissolved away, releasing massive payloads of calcium, magnesium, and other vital minerals. This specific chemical reaction is the absolute core of the Earth's long-term planetary thermostat. The dissolved silicate minerals chemically bonded with the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, forming liquid bicarbonates. These heavy, carbon-locked fluids were then flushed out of the deep rock by the groundwater, washed into the newly formed river systems, and carried out to sea. This leads to a deeply unsettling consequence regarding the longevity of biospheres, one that directly addresses the concept of the Great Filter. We naturally assume that a thriving, rapidly expanding biological system stabilizes a planet and ensures its long-term habitability. The Devonian forests suggest the exact, terrifying opposite. Archaeopteris weaponized the planetary carbon cycle. By accelerating silicate weathering by an estimated order of magnitude, these ancient forests began rapidly, mechanically stripping the greenhouse gas insulation right out of the atmosphere. The biosphere became too efficient at altering its own geochemistry. If a newly terraforming biosphere on a distant exoplanet cannot immediately establish a highly precise equilibrium in its carbon cycle, its very evolutionary success acts as a self-imposed extinction mechanism. The Devonian forests were freezing the Earth, actively pulling the warm greenhouse planet into a devastating glaciation. And exactly here, this massive terrestrial biological triumph perfectly connects with the oceanic abyss. The millions of tons of raw, dissolved rock and concentrated phosphorus liberated by the tree roots did not simply vanish into the water cycle. They flowed straight down the rivers, dumping massive, uninterrupted, toxic pulses of raw nutrients directly into the fragile, highly stratified, and dangerously warm waters of the Panthalassic Ocean. The continents had pulled the trigger, and the oceans were about to detonate. The true engine of the Devonian mass extinction was not the towering wooden trunks or the shading canopies, but the microscopic, silent chemical warfare occurring in absolute darkness, meters below the surface. To fuel the massive vertical growth of Archaeopteris, water and sunlight were not enough. The construction of complex biological molecules, particularly DNA and ATP, the fundamental energy currency of all living cells, strictly requires a specific, highly limiting element: phosphorus. But in the early Devonian, phosphorus was not freely floating in the soil because true soil did not yet exist. It was tightly locked inside the crystalline lattice of solid silicate bedrock. To access this vital nutrient, the deep taproots of the first forests could not rely on passive water absorption. They had to become active geological miners. As the root tips forced their way into the microscopic fissures of the stone, they began pumping out highly specialized metabolic byproducts known as organic acids, primarily malic, citric, and oxalic acids. This was not a passive leak. It was a targeted, energy-intensive exudation designed to weaponize the immediate chemical environment. When these organic acids came into contact with the silicate bedrock, they initiated a profound molecular reaction called chelation. The acids actively stripped metal ions, such as calcium, magnesium, and iron, pulling them entirely out of the rock's rigid crystal structure. Stripped of its foundational binding agents, the solid silicate lattice physically collapsed, dissolving into soft, amorphous clay minerals. Through this precise biochemical mechanism, the forests were literally eating the solid crust of the Earth. But the problem does not stop at the localized destruction of rock. This biological mining operation fundamentally altered the planetary phosphorus cycle. For billions of years before the Devonian, the release of phosphorus into the biosphere was dictated entirely by slow abiotic forces, volcanic uplift, and passive mechanical erosion by wind and rain. It was a highly constrained, trickling system. By deploying organic acids, the vascular roots bypassed the geological speed limit entirely. They unlocked the planetary vault, liberating massive, unprecedented volumes of biologically available phosphorus. This leads to a consequence of staggering ecological scale: the invention of pedogenesis, or the creation of true soil. As the roots dissolved the bedrock into clays, and as the massive lignified trunks eventually died and fell, the shattered rock mixed with the accumulation of complex, undecayed organic matter. This combination forged the first deep, structured soil horizons. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this new soil layer changes entirely. We often think of soil as mere dirt, an inert byproduct of nature. In reality, it is a highly advanced, globally distributed biological technology. A deep soil profile acts as a massive planetary sponge, radically altering the Earth's hydrological cycle. Before soil, rainwater hit the bare rock and immediately washed away. Now, the soil captured the rain, storing it, filtering it, and allowing immense aquifers to form. It became a colossal chemical reactor, continuously dissolving more rock and breeding vast, unseen networks of primitive fungi and bacteria. And precisely here, this biological triumph begins to connect with a much larger question regarding the longevity of advanced civilizations and the Fermi paradox. When astrobiologists consider the Great Filter, they typically imagine late-stage technological catastrophes, nuclear winter, artificial intelligence, or resource depletion. But the Devonian pedogenesis suggests a concept known as the Gaian bottleneck. This hypothesis proposes that the most dangerous period for any biosphere is not when it discovers technology, but when it first achieves the biological capacity to alter global biogeochemical cycles. If life on a habitable exoplanet evolves a mechanism as aggressive as deep-root exudation, it immediately seizes control of the planetary thermostat. The Earth's carbon silicate cycle was suddenly hijacked by biology. As the roots accelerated the weathering of rock, they systematically scrubbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locked it into the lithosphere and the expanding oceans. If a young biosphere cannot immediately establish a highly calibrated negative feedback loop to stabilize this sudden carbon drawdown, it will essentially suffocate its own greenhouse effect. The profound silence of the cosmos might be littered with worlds that froze solid simply because their early plant life was too successful at mining rock. The Great Filter might not be a technological test, but a biogeochemical threshold that most nascent biospheres accidentally cross, engineering their own ice ages before animal life even has the chance to develop complex nervous systems. If this dynamic holds true, it tells us that biological innovation is inherently destabilizing. The Devonian forests did not create an immediate ecological harmony, they triggered a runaway chain reaction. The newly liberated phosphorus, along with massive quantities of dissolved carbon and nitrogen, did not stay confined to the terrestrial soils. As the heavy rains washed over these newly engineered continents, the runoff carried a staggering, continuous payload of raw chemical fertilizers directly into the sprawling river systems. This sets the stage for the ultimate planetary collapse. The continents, having successfully conquered gravity and rewritten the chemistry of the lithosphere, were now blindly flushing the toxic byproducts of their success into the sea. The warm, highly stratified, and already precarious Panthalassic Ocean was about to receive an influx of nutrients unlike anything the Earth had ever experienced. The forests had built the weapon on land, but the detonation was destined for the deep water. The rivers of the late Devonian were no longer simply channels of water. Driven by the relentless subterranean mining operations of the newly formed terrestrial forests, these immense river systems had been transformed into heavy, dark arteries, carrying the dissolved remains of the continents directly into the sea. Millions of tons of raw, unbound phosphorus, iron, and silicate minerals were flushed out of the terrestrial soil horizons and dumped continuously into the shallow, warm, epicontinental margins of the Panthalassic Ocean. This colossal transfer of geology into the hydrosphere initiated one of the most devastating and rapid biological catastrophes in Earth's history: global marine eutrophication. To understand the mechanics of this collapse, we have to look at the fundamental constraints of marine biology. In a stable ocean ecosystem, primary production is governed by Liebig's law of the minimum. This principle states that biological growth is not dictated by the total resources available, but by the scarcest resource. For the photosynthetic phytoplankton that form the base of the marine food web, that limiting factor is almost always phosphorus. For millions of years, the Devonian oceans operated on a strict, starvation-level budget of this crucial element. But when the terrestrial forests shattered the lithosphere, they entirely removed this biological speed limit. When the massive plumes of phosphorus-rich runoff hit the sunlit, shallow seas, the phytoplankton reacted exactly as the laws of chemistry dictated. They entered a state of unconstrained, exponential cell division. The resulting algal blooms were of a scale that defies modern comparison. Vast stretches of the continental shelves were choked by a thick, opaque biological soup that physically blocked solar radiation from penetrating the water column. The benthic reefs, which had thrived in the crystal-clear, sun-drenched shallows, were suddenly plunged into deep shadow. But the sheer volume of this biological explosion was inherently unstable. An algal bloom functions essentially as an ecological Ponzi scheme. The phytoplankton rapidly exhaust other trace nutrients, or they simply block out their own light source. Within weeks, the hyperpopulation collapses. Billions of tons of microscopic organic matter die simultaneously and begin to sink into the deeper, darker layers of the ocean. And it is precisely here, in the twilight zone of the water column, that the true executioner awakens. The sinking biomass provides an infinite food source for massive populations of aerobic bacteria. As these bacteria consume the decaying algae, their cellular respiration requires enormous amounts of dissolved oxygen. They begin to breathe the ocean dry. This process was catastrophically amplified by the physical state of the Devonian planet. Because the Earth was in an extreme greenhouse phase with no polar ice caps, the oceans were highly thermally stratified. Without frigid polar water sinking to drive deep oceanic circulation, there was virtually no vertical mixing. The warm, oxygenated surface waters were physically separated from the colder depths by a rigid thermocline. When the bacteria consumed the oxygen in the mid to deep water layers, there was absolutely no physical mechanism to replenish it. The water transitioned from hypoxic, meaning low oxygen, to completely anoxic. It became a dead zone. At a planetary scale, the physical reality of an expanding dead zone is a terrifying fluid dynamic phenomenon. It is an invisible, expanding wall of suffocation. For the highly active, metabolically demanding predators of the Devonian, like the armored Dunkleosteus and the agile early sharks, anoxia is an immediate death sentence. As the dead zones expanded outward from the coastlines and upward from the ocean floor, marine life was forcefully compressed into rapidly shrinking slivers of oxygenated surface water. This extreme spatial restriction drove ecological competition to a breaking point, collapsing entire food webs in a matter of decades. We know this happened with absolute certainty because the Earth kept a meticulous physical ledger of the dead. Geologists recognize this exact moment in the stratigraphic record as the Kellwasser events. Across the globe, the vibrant, fossil-rich limestones of the Devonian are suddenly interrupted by thick, stark bands of black shale. This rock is black because it is heavily saturated with unoxidized organic carbon. In a healthy ocean, scavenging animals and bacteria would consume this carbon, and worms would churn the mud, oxidizing it. The black shales exist purely because the ocean floor became so intensely toxic, so completely devoid of oxygen, that absolutely nothing could survive to eat the sinking dead. The decay process itself was halted by the very environment it created. This leads to a profound and deeply unsettling perspective on the nature of life in the universe. When we gaze at the stars and apply the Fermi paradox, wondering why the galaxy seems entirely devoid of advanced civilizations, we often default to technological explanations. We assume that intelligence eventually builds weapons of mass destruction or exhausts its planetary resources through industrial greed. But the Devonian black shales offer a far more primitive, biological great filter. The mass extinction in the oceans was not caused by an asteroid impact, massive volcanism, or a supernova. It was caused by the sheer, blind, evolutionary success of the forests. The biosphere became too efficient at extracting nutrients and expanding its territory. It engineered a highly localized paradise on land by completely destabilizing the chemical equilibrium of the global ocean. If this dynamic is a universal property of biology, it drastically shifts our approach to astrobiology. When our next generation telescopes eventually detect the atmospheric signature of a highly active, rapidly expanding biosphere on a distant exoplanet, we cannot automatically assume it is a stable world on the long road to technological intelligence. A massive biological signal might not represent a thriving planetary ecosystem. It might represent a biosphere in the active, terminal phase of suffocating itself. The Devonian teaches us that life is not inherently harmonious with its host planet. It is a chaotic, aggressive force that can just as easily engineer its own apocalypse through the simple, unstoppable act of growing. And as the oceans choked on the success of the land, the atmosphere above was preparing to undergo an even more radical and permanent transformation. The expanding oceanic dead zones created an inescapable biological paradox. As the deep, open waters of the Panthalassic Ocean became toxic and completely devoid of oxygen, marine life was forced to flee toward the margins of the continents. But these coastlines were no longer the clear, sunlit reefs of the early Devonian. They had been entirely transformed by the terrestrial forests. The shores were now choked with massive, tangled root systems, fallen, lignified trunks, and deep, anoxic mud. The very biological engine that was suffocating the ocean had created a chaotic, highly structured labyrinth of shallow water and rotting vegetation along the edges of the landmasses. For the streamlined, high-speed predators of the open ocean, like the ray-finned fishes and the early cartilaginous sharks, this environment was a structural nightmare. Their parallel fin rays were designed for fluid hydrodynamics, utterly useless for navigating through a dense grid of submerged wooden obstacles. When pushed into the swamps by the expanding dead zones, the apex predators of the open water simply starved or suffocated. But for the lobe-finned fishes, this apocalyptic shift in the global environment presented an unprecedented ecological opportunity. Their clunky, robust appendages, anchored by a single heavy basal bone, had always been hydrodynamically inefficient in the open sea. But in the tangled, debris-filled swamps, hydrodynamic efficiency was entirely irrelevant. Survival in this new biome required mechanical leverage. The lobe-finned fishes could use their muscular fins to push against the mud and lever their heavy bodies over submerged roots. This extreme ecological pressure accelerated a morphological transition that is meticulously documented in the fossil record. By tracking the anatomical changes from deep-water lobe-finned fishes to the very first terrestrial amphibians, paleontologists have reconstructed one of the most significant engineering leaps in the history of life. The baseline of this transition is represented by fossils like Eusthenopteron, a pelagic fish that possessed the fundamental bone architecture of one bone, two bones, and a cluster of smaller bones in its fins, but remained strictly aquatic. As we move up the stratigraphic column into the late Devonian, the anatomy begins to radically flatten out. We find Pandarichthys, a creature that had entirely lost its dorsal and anal fins. In a shallow swamp where the water is only inches deep, a dorsal fin is not just useless, it is a liability that exposes the animal to the air and snags on vegetation. But the most critical biomechanical breakthrough was discovered in the high Canadian Arctic, locked in rock dating back roughly 375 million years. This fossil is Tiktaalik, widely celebrated as the perfect transitional form. Tiktaalik possessed gills and scales, firmly rooting it in its aquatic ancestry. However, its anatomical innovations suggest a creature operating at the absolute boundary between two physical realms. Unlike any fish before it, Tiktaalik had lost the bony plates covering its gills, known as the operculum. The removal of this rigid skeletal connection between the skull and the shoulder girdle created a completely novel anatomical feature: a neck. For a fish in three-dimensional open water, a neck is unnecessary. The animal simply turns its entire body to change its field of view. But in the shallow, two-dimensional plane of a mudflat, where the body is pinned by gravity against the substrate, the ability to independently rotate the head is a massive predatory advantage. It allows the organism to scan the surface and snap at prey without expending the massive energy required to reorient its entire heavy torso. Furthermore, the distal bones of Tiktaalik's pectoral fins had flattened and expanded into a primitive wrist. The joint geometry of these fossilized bones proves that they were capable of bearing weight and executing a pushing motion. Tiktaalik was capable of doing a push-up, lifting its heavy skull out of the hypoxic swamp water. This leads to a profound correction in our understanding of evolutionary history. For decades, it was commonly taught that fish evolved limbs to boldly conquer the dry land. Modern paleontology reveals that the exact opposite is true. Limbs did not evolve for walking on land. They evolved as highly specialized aquatic tools to avoid the land, allowing these creatures to navigate the choked, oxygen-depleted swamps without getting stuck. True tetrapods that followed Tiktaalik, such as Acanthostega, possessed fully formed digits. Acanthostega had 8 fingers on each hand, but its limb joints were strictly oriented backward, optimized for paddling through dense aquatic weeds, not for supporting its weight in the open air. Limbs were a water technology that accidentally contained the exact mechanical properties necessary for terrestrial locomotion. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this transitional sequence changes entirely, offering a stark lesson for astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The emergence of tetrapods, and by extension, the eventual rise of species capable of manipulating their environment to build civilizations, was not driven by peaceful, gradual exploration. It was driven by sheer, catastrophic environmental terror. The lobe-finned fishes were effectively evicted from the ocean by a planetary suffocation event. If this dynamic is a fundamental law of biological progression, it introduces a terrifying variable into the Fermi paradox. We often assume that an exoplanet with a perfectly stable, eternal ocean is the ideal cradle for advanced life. But the Devonian transitional fossils suggest a concept known as the stability trap. If a planetary environment remains too stable, if the ocean never becomes anoxic, and if the shallow margins never become deadly, life has absolutely no thermodynamic incentive to leave the water. A perfectly balanced, harmonious biosphere might be the ultimate evolutionary dead end. To push biology across the massive energetic and structural thresholds required to conquer gravity, the host planet must actively try to kill it. The Great Filter might operate as a mandatory sequence of controlled planetary disasters. A world must be unstable enough to force radical biomechanical innovation, but not so unstable that it sterilizes the crust entirely. The hands we use to build radio telescopes and spacecraft were not designed for the stars. They were forged in the desperate, suffocating mud of a dying ocean, attempting to survive the toxic consequences of the very first forests. And as these ancient pioneers pushed their heads above the waterline, they encountered an atmosphere that had been radically chemically altered by those same forests, fundamentally changing the mechanics of respiration itself. While the devastating effects of terrestrial runoff were suffocating the deeper waters, a completely different, silent tragedy was unfolding across the sunlit, shallow continental margins. Before the massive algal blooms blotted out the sun, the early and middle Devonian oceans hosted the largest continuous biological structures the Earth had ever produced. But these were not the coral reefs of the modern era. The primary architects of the Devonian megareefs were an entirely extinct class of marine organisms known as stromatoporoids. Stromatoporoids were ancient, highly specialized sponges. Unlike the soft, fibrous sponges we know today, they were prodigious biomineralizers. They extracted dissolved calcium and carbonate from the warm seawater and secreted dense, laminated layers of solid limestone. Over millions of years, these organisms constructed colossal, hyperdense underwater mountain ranges. We can still see the sheer magnitude of their engineering today in places like the Canning Basin in Western Australia, where a perfectly preserved, continuous Devonian reef complex stretches for over 350 kilometers across the arid outback. These massive reef systems functioned as the biological megacities of the Devonian. They provided infinite three-dimensional complexity, creating millions of microhabitats that sheltered a staggering diversity of marine life. But this extreme architectural success masked a fatal vulnerability. A biological megastructure is entirely dependent on absolute chemical stability. The stromatoporoids could only precipitate their heavy limestone skeletons within a very narrow window of ocean temperature and pH. As the deep taproots of the newly evolved terrestrial forests aggressively mined the continents, they fundamentally altered the planetary carbon cycle. The massive drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide by terrestrial plants, combined with sudden pulses of toxic weathering byproducts flushing into the sea, began to cause wild, erratic swings in the ocean's baseline chemistry. The water was slowly becoming hostile to the very act of biomineralization. The first victims of this subtle chemical shift were the most iconic survivors in Earth's history, the trilobites. For hundreds of millions of years, these heavily armored arthropods had dominated the ocean floor. Their survival strategy relied entirely on extracting calcium carbonate from the ocean to forge thick, rigid exoskeletons. They even engineered their visual systems out of the ocean's minerals. A trilobite's eyes were composed of perfectly aligned, rigid crystals of pure calcite. They possessed the only known biological lenses made of solid rock. But in the fluctuating chemistry of the late Devonian seas, this rigid biological blueprint became a deadly liability. As the oceans experienced localized drops in pH, driven by the massive influx of organic acids and the breakdown of algal blooms, the water became corrosive to calcium carbonate. Building and maintaining a thick calcite shell, let alone perfect crystalline eyes, suddenly required an exorbitant, unsustainable metabolic effort. The trilobites were trapped by their own ancient anatomy. The fossil record shows a steep, irreversible decline in their diversity. They were not merely being out-hunted by the new, fast-swimming, jawed fishes. They were being chemically evicted from the biosphere. But evolution is an open system, and the decline of one dominant lineage always creates an ecological vacuum for another. As the trilobites struggled to maintain their calcified armor, a different class of arthropods capitalized on the shifting parameters of survival. The Eurypterids, commonly known as sea scorpions. Eurypterids abandoned the heavy, chemically dependent calcite armor of the trilobites. Instead, their exoskeletons were constructed primarily of chitin, a tough, flexible, and chemically stable organic polymer that does not dissolve in mildly acidic water. This anatomical difference granted them immense ecological plasticity. While the trilobites and the massive stromatoporoid reefs were anchored to the deteriorating chemical conditions of the open ocean, the Eurypterids began a radical environmental migration. They used their versatile, paddle-like appendages to swim away from the dying reefs, moving directly against the flow of the rivers. The Eurypterids successfully invaded the newly forming brackish estuaries and freshwater swamps created by the terrestrial forests. This was a profoundly difficult biological leap. Moving from saltwater to freshwater requires a massive metabolic investment in osmoregulation, the ability to constantly pump excess water out of the body to prevent cellular rupture. But the reward for this high energy cost was absolute ecological dominance in a virgin environment. Some of these freshwater Eurypterids grew to monstrous proportions, reaching over 2 meters in length, becoming the undisputed apex predators of the Devonian river systems. At a planetary scale, the collapse of the stromatoporoid reefs and the ecological divergence of these ancient arthropods provide a highly specific analogue for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When astronomers theorize about highly advanced alien civilizations, they often look for Dyson spheres or massive planetary-scale engineering projects. We inherently associate longevity with the ability to construct colossal, rigid infrastructure. But the Devonian reefs warn us of a concept known as the megastructure trap. The larger and more highly integrated a biological or technological system becomes, the more deeply it relies on the absolute stability of its underlying environment. The stromatoporoids built the largest biological structures in the planet's history, and they were completely annihilated because they could not adapt to a slight shift in water chemistry. The trilobites possessed the most heavily fortified armor, and they essentially dissolved. If this dynamic holds true across the cosmos, it suggests that the Great Filter might aggressively eliminate the mega-builders of the galaxy. A civilization that completely intertwines its survival with massive, rigid, planetary-scale infrastructure becomes hyperfragile. The moment the host star fluctuates or the planetary chemistry shifts, the entire system collapses under its own systemic rigidity. The survivors of deep time might not be the civilizations that build galaxy-spanning empires. The survivors might look more like the Eurypterids, decentralized, highly adaptable, operating on flexible infrastructure, and willing to entirely abandon their historical strongholds to colonize harsher but chemically independent margins. And as we will see, this capacity to completely abandon the ancient environments was about to become the single most important trait for life on Earth, because the Devonian was preparing to deliver a final, catastrophic blow to the ocean itself. The ultimate consequence of the Devonian forests was not merely the creation of soil or the chemical suffocation of the shallow seas. It was a complete structural hijacking of the planetary atmosphere. To understand the sheer scale of this event, we have to look closely at the molecular composition of the forests themselves, and more importantly, at a critical flaw in the global ecosystem of the time. To build a towering forest canopy and defy gravity, terrestrial plants had synthesized lignin. This complex three-dimensional polymer was an absolute marvel of biological engineering, providing the immense compressive strength necessary to build wood. But it possessed a fatal characteristic at the ecosystem level. It was completely novel. When a modern tree falls, a highly specialized army of fungi and bacteria immediately goes to work, deploying advanced enzymes like ligninase to break the complex chemical bonds. This decomposition process releases the stored carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, completing the loop of the modern carbon cycle. In the late Devonian, that closed loop simply did not exist. The evolutionary leap to create dense wood was so rapid and unprecedented that the planet's microscopic decomposers were left millions of years behind. There were virtually no biological agents capable of efficiently dismantling lignin. When these ancient botanical giants died, they collapsed into the hypoxic mud of their own engineered swamps, but they did not rot. They simply piled up. Layer upon layer of dense, undecayed biological matter accumulated over millennia, slowly being buried under river sediment and tectonic pressure. This was not just a collection of dead wood, this was captured atmospheric carbon, physically removed from the sky and permanently locked into the deep lithosphere of the Earth. Geochemical models of the Devonian atmosphere outline a staggering transition. Before the forests, carbon dioxide concentrations hovered at roughly 4,000 parts per million, creating the thick, sweltering thermal blanket that characterized the early greenhouse world. But as the silent, unrotting forests spread across Euramerica and Gondwana, they acted as a colossal, unidirectional carbon drain. The carbon dioxide levels plummeted. The Earth's thermal insulation was being systematically disassembled by the sheer, unconstrained success of the terrestrial biosphere. This massive carbon sequestration triggered a thermodynamic inevitability. The global climate, rapidly stripped of its primary greenhouse gas, began to run in reverse. The The warm, stable, ice-free world that had nurtured the explosive radiation of marine life was fundamentally broken. In the southern hemisphere, across the vast interior of the supercontinent Gondwana, temperatures plummeted. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, the South Pole reached the freezing point. Massive continental ice sheets began to form, and this introduces a secondary, devastating physical mechanism, the albedo feedback loop. As white glacial ice spreads across a landmass, it violently reflects incoming solar radiation back into space, rather than absorbing it as dark rock or ocean water would. This reflection drastically accelerated the planetary cooling process, locking the Earth into a rapidly intensifying ice age. The formation of these colossal glaciers had an immediate mechanical impact on the global ocean. As billions of tons of water were pulled from the atmospheric cycle and frozen onto the southern landmass, global sea levels experienced a catastrophic drop. The shallow, warm epicontinental seas, which were already choking on toxic terrestrial runoff and expanding anoxia, were suddenly drained. The intricate, highly specialized stromatoporoid reef systems were left completely exposed to the freezing open air. The biological havens that had defined the Devonian oceans were physically deleted from the map. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this biologically induced ice age forces a complete re-evaluation of how we understand habitability. We inherently lean toward a romanticized view of nature, assuming that a complex biosphere naturally self-regulates to maintain optimal, harmonious conditions for life. The late Devonian carbon crisis proves this is a comforting illusion. Life is not inherently stabilizing. It is a blind, aggressive thermodynamic force. The ancient forests did not possess the foresight to stop pulling carbon from the sky. They simply maximized their immediate biological success, expanding relentlessly until they entirely inadvertently froze their own world. This concept introduces a highly specific geochemical mechanism for the Great Filter, deeply relevant to our modern search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When next-generation telescopes eventually scan the galaxy and detect the atmospheric signatures of a young, highly active biosphere, perhaps a world completely covered in towering alien vegetation, we might instinctively view it as a thriving planet on the inevitable path to advanced animal life. But the Devonian tells us that such a world might be a ticking climatic time bomb. If an alien biosphere evolves a highly efficient structural polymer to conquer its local gravity, but suffers a similar evolutionary lag in developing the microscopic ecosystem necessary to recycle it, that biosphere will inadvertently strip its planet of vital greenhouse gases. The world will plunge into a biologically induced snowball state, crushing its nascent ecosystems under miles of ice long before complex nervous systems or technological intelligence can ever emerge. The silent, frozen exoplanets we detect in the habitable zones of other stars might not be barren because life never started. They might simply be worlds where the early plant life was far too successful, locking their own atmospheres away in the dark, permanent vaults of their alien lithospheres. The Earth miraculously survived its first global forest, but the cost was an apocalyptic restructuring of the biosphere, setting the stage for a new, colder world where survival would require entirely different biomechanical paradigms. The Devonian mass extinction was not a single catastrophic afternoon like the asteroid impact that would later erase the non-avian dinosaurs. It was a prolonged, agonizing planetary restructuring that spanned millions of years, defined by two distinct, massive pulses of global death, known to geologists as the Kellwasser and the Hangenberg events. For decades, the dominant scientific narrative laid the blame entirely at the roots of the first forests. The biological assassination model is elegant. Terrestrial plants aggressively mined the bedrock, flushed toxic nutrients into the oceans to create global anoxia, and simultaneously sucked so much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that they plunged a greenhouse world into a devastating ice age. But the fossil and geochemical records present a profound inconsistency that this purely biological model struggles to explain. The Earth did not simply freeze and stay frozen. High-resolution isotopic data extracted from ancient marine sediments reveals a planet experiencing violent, erratic climatic whiplash. The global temperature did not just drop, it swung wildly between deep glacial freezes and sudden, blistering hypothermal spikes. The plant-driven drawdown of carbon can explain the cold, but it is thermodynamically incapable of explaining the sudden, rapid returns to extreme heat. This discrepancy leads to a deeply compelling, competing geological hypothesis. Deep beneath the crust of what is now modern-day Siberia, a colossal thermal anomaly was rising from the Earth's core mantle boundary. This mantle plume eventually ruptured the surface, creating a large igneous province known as the Willowy Traps. This was not a localized volcanic cone erupting with ash. It was a continental-scale fissure system, bleeding millions of cubic kilometers of basaltic lava across the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. The Willowy Traps injected staggering, incomprehensible quantities of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, directly into the stratosphere. This geological event initiated a brutal, planetary-scale tug-of-war with the biological engine of the forests. The trees were relentlessly pulling carbon down, while the mantle was violently pumping it back up. The result was not a stable equilibrium, but a chaotic, oscillating climate system that shattered the adaptive capacities of almost every complex organism on Earth. But the volcanic hypothesis introduces an even more insidious kill mechanism. When massive volumes of basaltic magma intrude through continental crust, they heat up deeply buried deposits of ancient salt and organic matter. This thermogenic reaction releases massive plumes of volatile halocarbons and mercury straight into the upper atmosphere. In the stratosphere, these halogens act as aggressive chemical catalysts, violently stripping oxygen atoms away from ozone molecules. We have absolute physical proof of this atmospheric destruction. Paleobotanists examining microscopic plant spores from the end of the Devonian period have discovered a terrifying anomaly. A massive percentage of these fossilized spores exhibit severe, chaotic genetic malformations. Their protective walls are darkened, warped, and covered in mutated spikes. These are the exact morphological signatures of extreme DNA damage caused by unshielded ultraviolet B radiation. The Willowy eruptions had effectively burned a hole through the Earth's ozone layer. The towering forests that had conquered the continents were suddenly bathed in sterilizing cosmic radiation, collapsing the terrestrial food webs just as the oceans were suffocating below. Modern paleontology is rapidly shifting toward this synergistic model. The Devonian extinction was not exclusively biological or exclusively geological. It was a catastrophic intersection of both. The biosphere had perfectly primed the planet for disaster by chemically stressing the oceans and draining the atmospheric buffer, making the global ecosystem hyper-fragile, exactly at the moment the mantle decided to catastrophically degas. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this climatic whiplash changes entirely, offering a profound new variable for the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We often assume that an alien civilization must only survive one type of planetary disaster at a time, but the Devonian intersection suggests a concept known as the whiplash filter. The most dangerous phase in a planet's history might be the precise window when a rapidly terraforming biosphere chemically collides with a natural geological reset. If an exoplanet is subjected to rapid oscillating extremes, freezing, then boiling, then being irradiated, the biological infrastructure simply cannot mutate fast enough to keep up. The true great filter might not be fire or ice, but the lethal speed of the transition between the two. When the dust finally settled and the Hangenberg event concluded the Devonian period, the biological landscape of the Earth was rendered completely unrecognizable. The supreme biomechanical perfection of the placoderms, including the terrifying Dunkleosteus, was entirely erased. The massive stromatoporoid reefs were reduced to dead, dissolving limestone. The oceans had been permanently humbled, but out of this apocalypse, a highly specific legacy emerged. The survivors were not the apex predators or the magnificent reef builders. The survivors were the marginal, the adaptable, and the highly efficient. The early cartilaginous sharks, with their low metabolic overhead, survived the nutrient collapse and radiated out to claim the oceans. And in the choked, toxic, irradiated swamps, the clunky lobe-finned fishes, with their primitive, heavy wrists, survived precisely because they were already adapted to the absolute worst conditions the planet had to offer. These desperate mud crawlers were the direct ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates. Every amphibian, reptile, dinosaur, mammal, and human being alive today owes its entire anatomical architecture to the survivors of the Devonian anoxia. And precisely here, this deep geological history connects directly with our modern technological era. The billions of tons of lignin, the complex wood that the Devonian fungi could not rot, did not simply vanish. It was buried deep within the Earth's crust, compressed by tectonic forces over hundreds of millions of years. This unrotted Devonian and subsequent Carboniferous biomass became the foundational matrix of the planet's coal reserves. When humanity ignited the Industrial Revolution, we did not just discover a new energy source, we cracked open the subterranean vaults of the Devonian forests. The very same atmospheric carbon dioxide that Archaeopteris pulled from the ancient greenhouse sky to build the first terrestrial wood is exactly what we are currently burning to power our global civilization. We are actively reversing the exact biological terraforming process that nearly sterilized the Earth 360 million years ago. If this dynamic holds true, it tells us that the legacy of a planetary biosphere is never truly erased. It is merely stored, waiting in the dark, serving as either the fuel for a future civilization's rise or the exact mechanism of its ultimate collapse.